I'm going to begin with an example that might at first hearing sound a little bit odd, but do bear with me. I want you to imagine the stage at the end of a production of Hamlet. What does it look like? Well, it's a Shakespeare tragedy, so you've got a heap of bodies, together with their clothes and their dress accessories and their weapons and equipment and things like that. And then beyond that, you've got all the other props, the furniture and what have you, the stage set itself. It's quite a complicated scene if you imagine it in that way, and especially if you imagine it as an archaeological site. Imagine excavating the stage at the end of Hamlet, providing, of course, nobody moves. Think of the graves we looked at as exactly that, the stage at the end of a play, where all the dead people and the animals and the objects, all those things placed so very, very carefully, as we saw, are where they've ended up at the end of the roles that they've played out. Do you see what I mean? That these things are a kind of fossilized stage set. And then, of course, going back to Hamlet, or for that matter, any other drama, think of all the action, all the dialogue, all the very, very complex aspects of the story that are not present right at the end at that final curtain, but that nonetheless are very much a part of everything that's led up to that. All the people who aren't even on the stage at that point, who've come and gone. In the case of Hamlet, you've got a good 3, maybe even 4 hours of drama. What about Ibn Fadlan, the Arab traveller that we saw yesterday, with his description of 10 days of people doing all those kinds of things? That's what I mean by this kind of funerary drama. What actually then were they doing? At this point, I'm just going to suggest a few of the things that those stories might have been about, and then these are themes that I'm going to follow up in the rest of the talk. I think we might be fairly safe in assuming that those kinds of dramatized stories might have had something to do with the dead person or the dead people. Probably also something to do with the mourners, if that's what we want to call them, the people who are actually doing all this, making the grave, conducting the funeral. The dead person's family and the family of the mourners, perhaps the same thing. Perhaps they're stories of land and place, the environment in which all of this is taking place. And then add some time depth to that, the history of those places and those people. And then, if you go back a bit further still, into legend and mythology, a different kind of history. And if you remember some of the points I made in the first lecture, a different kind of reality. Stories of gods and other supernatural beings. But all of them narrated within a wide social framework, the community and the larger society, but, as we've seen in that infinite variety of burial ritual, with specific elements for this person, for this grave, today, to do those things. And I can't resist explaining this, or not explaining, but just telling you a bit about this rather peculiar grave you see on the left there. This is one that was excavated only a couple of years ago. It's a good example of how much information you can get out of these burials, in terms of sequence, for example. At the foot of the grave, inside the grave itself, is a standing stone. You have a dog here, which the artist has sanitized very slightly. Remember, I apologized yesterday for getting a bit gross with Viking burials. Here we go again. You have a standing stone, and then they've sort of squashed a dog down over the standing stone. And you've got a sequence in there. Then you've got the dead woman lying there, as you can see, and a horse in a grave that's so small the horse is actually on top of her. Very difficult to arrange a dead horse to look like this. I think it was alive when it was driven down into the grave, and then probably its throat was cut or something like that. So it's actually standing on the dead person, and then you have all the other objects as well. So think of what's there and what isn't, and the sequence of action. This is the kind of detail that you can get out. But it may be, and I completely understand if it's the case, that you doubt that these could be stories. It's just an idea after all. So what I want to do now to support that a little bit is to turn to a rather different area and a different medium, although also connected with the dead, that can give us some hints about what these stories are and what they're for. And we're going to look at a special kind of monument on a special place, the Baltic island of Gotland. In the Viking Age, Gotland is essentially a separate country. It's an island community at the centre of the Baltic, at the centre of all the movement through the Baltic, and everything on Gotland is just a little bit different. Very similar to the rest of Scandinavia, but the way they dress, the kinds of things they use, the houses they build, the graves they create, they're just a little bit different from everywhere else, even beyond that idea of variation. And I want to look particularly at a special class of burial monument. They're known as picture stones. I showed you one of these briefly the other day, but what they are is large, flat slabs of limestone. The smallest are about this big, and the biggest come up to the top of the screen. So they can vary quite widely. The kind you see here are the top of the screen variety. So they're bigger than you can see them on the screen itself. Very large monuments. And as you can see, they're carved with lots and lots of pictures. And they generally appear in two forms, either divided into doesn't sound good. Divided into parallel bands, a bit like a comic strip here, or with more jumbled images just heaped up. But in all of them, a ship is a very prominent part of the lower field of the stone. It's tempting to read a sequence into the ones in the horizontal panels, but even in the more jumbled ones, there may be structure in that image nonetheless. We also don't know, for example, if there's perspective in it. You might effectively see something in 3 dimensions flipped vertically. It's hard to tell, but lots and lots of information. There are several hundred of these stones with thousands and thousands of images collectively. Very difficult to understand, but a fascinating visual record coming to us from the Viking Age. We know that these things are memorials to the dead. Effectively, they're a kind of tombstone. Sometimes they're set up on burial mounds in the cemeteries. Sometimes they're on the farms, but they're connected with the dead. You find burials at the foot of many of these stones. The first suggestion I want to make to you, and I should say it's not my work, this is the work of a man called Anders Andrian, concerns the fact that, rather strangely, for an island dependent on an entirely maritime economy, Gotland has no ship or boat burials of any kind. It's one of the few places in the Viking world that has none of this. There are no ships or boats in the graves. And if you look at a ship burial from the mainland, this is one from Vendel in Sweden, think about all those objects laid out on the deck and the dead person in the middle there and the animals and all the rest. Think of them as ideas, think of them as a potential part of a story or part of a play, as I've described, and then imagine how you would draw that. Can it be that the picture stones are effectively pictorial ship burials, hence the boat in the lower part of the field? There's something else that adds to this. This professor that I mentioned, Anders Andrian, works in Stockholm. He looked at a number of these stones in great detail, and he managed to identify some of the stories that we have from Norse mythology. You have the overall motif, as I've said, of the ship at the bottom, but if you start in the lower field and read up, you can actually make sense of these pictures in line with stories from Norse mythology, especially, in this case, the story of Sigurd, the dragon slayer. If you like your Wagner, this is one of the main stories behind his Ring cycle. And the really exciting thing is that when you look at the location of these stones out in the countryside, they're spaced around the edges of property boundaries, around the edges of estates. So you have one stone like this, standing up in the countryside, and then you go around the property boundary to the next stone, and you find that the top panel on one stone is repeated as the bottom panel of the next, and then the story goes on. So these monuments to the dead are very definitely stories. This is what they look like when they're out in the countryside. This one's been eroded by the wind and the weather, so it's blank, largely blank to the eye now, but if you go close to it, you can see that there are pictures on it. So what you have are memorials to the dead, which we can also see as claims to land, because they're marking out the boundary of territory. And because they are memorials to the dead, they're also making a link between the ancestors, all the people that have died there, and that land. This is my land, because that's my father's burial, and that's my grandfather's, and that's his father's, marking out literally the boundaries of the land. And most importantly, that statement is expressed through a kind of story. I think we can say a family story, because it's linked to the land owned by a particular group. And it's told in sequential, I can call them chapters, added from one generation to the next, because there's a time interval between these burials. So that's quite a package of things, really. There's also one other tantalizing element here. You may have noticed that all of these stones are shaped like keyholes. That characteristic shape is also found as the doors on stave churches. These are the earliest kinds of wooden churches that we have in the north. And there's an idea that these things are doors. Doors into somewhere else, another world. I just remind you of two things here. When I was talking about Ibn Fadlan's description of the ship burial, remember the slave who was lifted up to look over a door into somewhere else. The same idea. And then remember, in the very first story yesterday, that complicated boat with lots of people in it that was buried on top of someone who'd been buried 50 years before, think of that time interval, the fact that they know they're going to do that in advance. They bury someone and they know that a few decades later they're going to add to that sequence, just as they do when they start setting these stones out in the countryside. So, we have people living on their farms, marking their possession with memorials to the landowners of the family, each one merging, as they die, as they're buried, with a family story, as the property is gradually ringed, perhaps with points of entry into another world. That's quite a sequence, I think. I've mentioned the same kind of idea in that boat burial from Norway. You can find this notion of referencing between one grave and another, referencing, I would say, between stories, when you go back to the graves themselves. I'll just give you one example from the mainland. This is a rather magnificent woman's grave from a place called Gausel in Norway. And you see she's buried in a coffin, surrounded by big stones with various things in the grave. A very high status grave indeed. From the same cemetery, just a few metres away, is a rather magnificent boat burial. Quite a large boat, a man in the middle here, surrounded by weapons, lots and lots of weapons. You can see 4 shields, a sword, all kinds of things, 2 swords in fact. At first glance, you might not think there was much similar between these burials. They're clearly a very different type of monument. Except that if you look, both of them contain the severed head of a horse with a bridle on it, a very rich bridle, a bridle made of gold, actually. And you find these horses' heads in several of the other graves on that cemetery. graves that are separated by several decades, in some cases over a century. Again, they're referencing between one grave and the next. And I would argue you could probably see this same idea of a sequential chapter in a story being added, in this case, through the medium of a burial and all its contents, as opposed to pictorially on those stones from Gotland.